In November 1956, something happened that changed the world forever. The most powerful empire in human history, an empire that had ruled a quarter of the Earth's surface, an empire whose currency had dominated global trade for over a century, was brought to its knees in just 11 days. Not by a military defeat, not by a revolution, but by a phone call. On that phone call, the United States government delivered an ultimatum to Britain. Stop your military operation in Egypt immediately, or we will collapse your currency. We will sell every British pound we own. We will veto your emergency loan from the International Monetary Fund. We will watch your economy burn. Britain had no choice. Within hours, the greatest empire the world had ever seen surrendered. Not to an enemy army, but to its own debt, to its own weakness, to the reality that it was no longer the power it believed itself to be. That moment, known as the Suez Crisis, was the final nail in the coffin of British global dominance. But here's what they don't teach you in school. Here's what the history books conveniently leave out. America will collapse like Britain did because we're making the exact same financial mistakes. The financial crisis coming in 2026 isn't a coincidence, it's history repeating itself. When you understand how America will collapse like Britain did, when you see the financial crisis patterns that destroyed the British Empire, you'll never look at America the same way again. Let me show you exactly what happened, because when you see the pattern, everything becomes clear. To understand how Britain fell, you first have to understand how Britain rose. In the 19th century, Britain was the undisputed master of the global economy. The British pound wasn't just a currency, it was the currency. When countries traded with each other, they used pounds. When central banks stored their reserves, they stored pounds. When international contracts were written, they were written in pounds. This gave Britain an almost supernatural power. They could print money to fund their military. They could borrow at incredibly low interest rates because everyone trusted the pound. They could run trade deficits year after year because the world needed their currency more than Britain needed to balance its books. Sound familiar? It should. But there was a problem brewing beneath the surface. By the late 1800s, a new economic power was rising across the Atlantic. The United States had surpassed Britain as the world's largest economy. American factories were outproducing British factories. American innovation was outpacing British innovation. American wealth was growing faster than British wealth. Yet the pound remained dominant. Why? Because of something economists call inertia. The world was used to using pounds. The financial infrastructure was built around pounds. Changing to a new system would be inconvenient. So even as Britain's economic foundation weakened, its currency remained strong for a while. Then came World War I. Britain borrowed staggering sums to finance the war. By the time the guns fell silent in 1918, Britain had transformed from the world's largest creditor nation into one of the world's largest debtor nations. They owed money to everyone, especially to the United States. But instead of accepting this new reality, instead of adjusting their spending and their ambitions to match their diminished position, Britain made a fatal choice. They tried to pretend nothing had changed. In 1925, Britain made what historians consider one of the greatest economic blunders of the 20th century. They returned to the gold standard at the pre-war exchange rate. They wanted the pound to be worth the same as it had been before the war, even though Britain itself was no longer worth what it had been before the war. It was pure ego, pure denial, and it was devastating. To maintain this artificially high value of the pound, Britain had to keep interest rates painfully high. This strangled economic growth. Unemployment soared. British exports became too expensive for foreign buyers. Meanwhile, British leaders kept spending as if they still ruled the world. They maintained military bases across the globe. They funded an empire they could no longer afford. They borrowed and borrowed and borrowed. Does any of this sound familiar yet? The cracks really started to show in the 1930s. During the Great Depression, speculators began attacking the pound. They could see the math didn't add up. Britain was spending more than it earned, borrowing more than it could repay, and pretending that reputation alone would keep the whole system afloat. In 1931, Britain was forced off the gold standard entirely. The pound lost nearly 30% of its value almost overnight. But here's the remarkable thing. Even after this humiliation, the pound remained a major reserve currency. Why? Because of the British Empire itself. Britain forced its colonies to hold their reserves in pounds. India, Australia, Pakistan, dozens of other territories had no choice but to keep using British currency. Britain was essentially holding its own colonies hostage to prop up its failing financial system. America, by the way, is doing something eerily similar right now. The petrodollar system, where oil is priced exclusively in dollars, has forced the world to hold American currency whether they want to or not. The difference is that colonies eventually gain independence, and oil-producing nations eventually get tired of American foreign policy. Then came World War II. Britain borrowed even more heavily, this time racking up debts of over £14 billion, an astronomical sum in that era. By 1945, Britain owed more money than its entire economy produced in a year. The empire was essentially bankrupt, surviving only because of American loans and American patience. And still, British leaders refused to accept reality. They kept their military deployed around the world. They kept pretending to be a superpower. They kept spending money they didn't have on prestige they could no longer afford. This brings us to 1956 and the moment everything finally collapsed. When Egypt's president nationalized the Suez Canal, Britain saw it as a challenge to their authority, a threat to their access to Middle Eastern oil, and an insult to their imperial pride. Together with France and Israel, Britain launched a military invasion to retake the canal. The military operation was actually succeeding. British forces were advancing, Egyptian resistance was crumbling, but Britain forgotten something crucial. They were no longer the world's banker. America was. And America was furious. President Eisenhower saw the invasion as old-fashioned colonialism, exactly the kind of behavior that was pushing newly independent nations towards the Soviet Union. He decided to teach Britain a lesson it would never forget. The United States threatened to dump its holdings of British pounds on the open market. This would have caused the pound to collapse, making Britain unable to import the food and oil its people needed to survive. America also blocked Britain's emergency loan from the International Monetary Fund. British foreign currency reserves were draining at over £100 million per week. They were days away from complete financial catastrophe. British Prime Minister Anthony Eden had no choice. He ordered a ceasefire and a complete withdrawal from Egypt. In exchange, America allowed Britain to receive its IMF loan. The empire had been brought to heel by its own creditor. The Suez Crisis lasted just 11 days, but those 11 days revealed what had been true for decades. Britain was not a superpower anymore. Britain was a debtor nation that had been living on borrowed time and borrowed money. The moment its creditors decided to call in the debt, the whole illusion collapsed. Now let me tell you why this story should terrify every American. The United States today is following the exact same playbook that destroyed Britain. Not similar, not comparable, exact. Britain's debt-to-GDP ratio after World War II was over 200%. America's debt-to-GDP ratio right now is approaching 120% and climbing rapidly. We added over $2 trillion to our national debt just this year alone. We're borrowing $7 billion every day just to keep the government running. Britain lost its reserve currency status partly because it kept spending on a global military presence it could no longer afford. America currently spends more on its military than the next 9 countries combined. We have over 750 military bases in more than 80 countries. We're policing the world with a credit card. Britain maintained the illusion of power by forcing colonies to use the pound. America maintains the illusion of power by forcing oil to be sold in dollars. But that system is cracking. China and Russia now conduct most of their trade in their own currencies. The BRICS nations are actively building alternative payment systems. Even traditional American allies are starting to hedge their bets. Britain refused to accept its diminished status and kept acting as the dominant power even when the numbers told a different story. America still acts as if it's 1995, as if we produce everything the world needs, as if there's no alternative to the dollar, as if our military can solve every problem. That arrogance cost Britain everything. It's about to cost America the same. But here's the part that really keeps me up at night. Britain's fall happened gradually, then suddenly. For decades, the warning signs were there. The debt accumulation, the industrial decline, the overextended military. But because the pound remained strong, because the empire still looked impressive on a map, British leaders convinced themselves that the good times would last forever. Then came one crisis, just one, and in 11 days, a century of dominance was over. America's Suez moment is coming. It could be a failed military intervention that turns the world against us. It could be a debt ceiling crisis where Congress plays chicken one too many times and the world decides American treasury bonds are no longer a safe bet. It could be a geopolitical humiliation where we try to use financial sanctions and the target simply refuses to comply because they no longer need our banking system. It could be something we can't even predict, some shock that reveals what has been true for years. America is living beyond its means, sustained only by the world's willingness to keep accepting our currency. The numbers for 2026 are particularly alarming. The Congressional Budget Office projects that interest payments on the national debt will exceed $1 trillion annually. We'll be spending more on interest than we spend on defense, more on interest than we spend on Medicare. We'll be like a household that's so deep in credit card debt that the minimum payments alone consume most of the paycheck. When Britain reached this point, the end came fast. There was no gradual decline. There was no gentle transition. One day, Britain was making demands. The next day, Britain was taking orders. One day, the pound was a symbol of global power. The next day, it was a cautionary tale. The British Empire made many mistakes in its final decades, but its final mistake, the one that sealed its fate, was the refusal to see what was right in front of its face. British leaders kept telling themselves that reputation would substitute for reality, that history entitled them to a future, that the world owed them something because of who they used to be. America is telling itself the same story right now. We believe that because we won the Cold War, because we built the internet, because we put men on the moon, the world will keep accepting our currency and our leadership forever. We believe that being American means the rules of economics don't apply to us. Every fallen empire believed the same thing. The British pound didn't collapse because of enemies. It collapsed because of choices. Choices to spend more than they earned, choices to borrow instead of build, choices to maintain pride instead of maintain solvency, choices to live in the past instead of preparing for the future. America is making those same choices right now, every single day, and the clock is ticking. I'm not telling you this to make you feel hopeless. I'm telling you this because history is the best teacher we have, but only if we're willing to learn. Britain ignored every warning sign until it was too late. We still have a chance to do something different, but that window is closing. There's one more parallel I need to share with you, and this one is perhaps the most chilling of all. Before Suez, before the humiliation, there was a moment when Britain could have changed course. In the early 1950s, a few economists and treasury officials saw what was coming. They wrote internal memos warning that Britain's financial position was unsustainable. They begged political leaders to cut military spending, to stop pretending, to accept the new reality of a post-imperial world. Those warnings were ignored. Politicians didn't want to hear bad news. The public didn't want to accept decline. The newspapers called the pessimists traitors and defeatists. Everyone wanted to believe that Britain was still great, still powerful, still special. So the spending continued, the borrowing continued, the denial continued, until November 1956, when reality could no longer be ignored. America is at that exact same moment right now. The warnings are everywhere. The Congressional Budget Office has been screaming about unsustainable debt for years. Economists across the political spectrum agree that the current trajectory is a mathematical impossibility. Former Treasury secretaries, Federal Reserve chairs, and even Wall Street executives are publicly warning that something has to change. And just like in Britain, those warnings are being ignored. Politicians keep promising tax cuts and new spending programs. The public keeps expecting services without paying for them. Anyone who points out the math is dismissed as a pessimist or an alarmist. We even have our own version of the British obsession with the gold standard. Britain destroyed its economy trying to maintain an exchange rate that no longer reflected reality. America is destroying its economy trying to maintain a lifestyle that no longer reflects reality. We consume more than we produce. We spend more than we earn. We borrow from the future to pay for the present. And we tell ourselves this can go on forever because we're America. Let me be clear about what happens when a reserve currency falls. It's not an abstract economic concept. It's devastation for ordinary people. When the pound collapsed, British citizens watched their savings lose value. The cost of imports skyrocketed. Inflation ate away at wages. Jobs disappeared as industries that depended on cheap foreign inputs could no longer compete. The standard of living that British people had taken for granted evaporated within a generation. If the dollar loses its reserve currency status, every American will feel it. Everything we import, which is almost everything we consume, will cost dramatically more. Interest rates on mortgages, car loans, and credit cards will spike. The government will have to either slash services or raise taxes, or both. The comfortable American middle-class lifestyle will become a memory. This is not fear-mongering. This is history. This is exactly what happened to Britain. This is exactly what happens when a debtor nation loses the trust of its creditors. The timeline is what concerns me most. Britain's transition from apparent strength to obvious weakness took about 30 years, from 1920 to 1950, but the final collapse when it came took less than 2 weeks. America's transition has been underway since at least the 1970s, when we went off the gold standard. We've been running trade deficits every single year since 1975. We've been accumulating debt at an accelerating pace since the 2008 financial crisis. The foundation has been weakening for 50 years, which means the collapse, when it comes, will be even more sudden than Britain's was. I don't know if that collapse will come in 2026 specifically. Nobody can predict the exact moment when confidence breaks, but I do know that every year that passes without fundamental change makes the eventual reckoning worse. Every $1 trillion we add to the debt, every factory we offshore, every month we spend more than we earn, brings us closer to our own Suez moment. The question is not whether America will face its Suez moment. The question is whether we'll be prepared when it arrives, whether we'll have built the resilience, the savings, the real productive capacity to weather the storm, or whether we'll be like Britain in November 1956, watching helplessly as decades of denial catch up to us in a matter of days. What can you do? First, understand that the government is not going to save you. British citizens who trusted their government to manage the transition lost everything. The people who protected themselves, who diversified their assets, who built real skills and real savings were the ones who survived. The same will be true here. Second, pay attention to the warning signs. When you see foreign central banks reducing their dollar holdings, when you see major countries signing agreements to trade in other currencies, when you see the interest payments on national debt exceeding military spending, know that the clock is ticking faster. Third, don't let normalcy bias blind you. The most dangerous phrase in finance is "this time is different." Every empire that fell believed it was different. Every reserve currency that collapsed was held by people who couldn't imagine a world without it. History doesn't care about our beliefs. It only cares about math. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And right now, the rhyme between Britain then and America now is almost perfect. Same debt patterns, same military overreach, same arrogance, same blindness, same refusal to see what's right in front of our faces.
The British Empire's final mistake was believing it was too big to fail. America is making that same mistake right now. We're living in the echo of history, following footsteps that lead off a cliff, and most people are too comfortable to notice. The only question left is whether we'll wake up in time or whether 2026 will be our 1956. I'll see you in the next one. Subscribe.